so pleased and excited today that we're going to be kicking off the new year with 3 items to be considered for calendaring. These items are the first of several proposals that we've been working on during this past year. And before we get to them, I want to provide some context for these proposals. Our Executive Director, Lisa Kersavage, will begin the meeting by sharing LPC's equity framework. And this is a framework that is intended to guide our priorities agency-wide this year. And she will also explain how the items that we're proposing for calendaring today fit into that framework. And I know this is unusual for us to make such a presentation, but these are challenging times. This last year has been one of the most challenging our nation has faced, with attacks on democracy, the pandemic, with the loss of life, damage to the economy, and how it exposed systemic failures, as well as the killing of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, and the despair and anger expressed subsequently. So I believe that these events have made it important for us to publicly reaffirm our commitment to equity in all aspects of our work. And we've spent the last several months about a framework that ensures our commitment and that will formally lay the groundwork for our work this year and into the future. So the policy goals of equity have been a touchstone of Mayor de Blasio's administration, and addressing equity in every aspect of LPC's work has been my priority throughout my tenure. And this includes enhancing transparency and accessibility in our regulatory work and prioritizing designations that represent New York City's diversity and designations in areas less represented by landmarks. And our recent designations reflect that prioritization. So with this background, we will today share work that we have done, and we will explain our framework and explain how the work that we'll be doing in the coming months will fit into that framework. And so with that, I will turn it over to Lisa to begin the presentation.
Great, thank you, Sarah, and good morning, commissioners. So to accomplish Chair Carroll's prioritization of equity and inclusion in our work, the agency is seeking to ensure diversity and inclusion in our designations, to make sure that we're telling the story of all New Yorkers, to ensure effective outreach, both for our regulatory work and in garnering support for designation, which requires the agency to acknowledge and work with the incredible diversity amongst New Yorkers in terms of language and culture, and to ensure fairness, transparency, and efficiency in regulations, making sure that all property owners understand the agency's processes and have equal access to resources. This ensures that proposed work is approved in a timely manner and that we are supporting property owners through technical assistance and improved guidance. With these goals in mind, or with these equity goals in mind, specific plans for this year include, for our regulatory work, first, I'm really thrilled to announce that LPC will soon be launching a major initiative to develop robust e-filing process, which will make filing, managing, and tracking applications easier for all, particularly homeowners who file their own applications. Secondly, we are also focusing on increased outreach to homeowners on how to work with LPC and ensure access, fairness, and transparency. In our administration department, while we don't have a large capital budget, we have sought to improve our MWBE performance, and while we are proud that we have among the highest grades in the city from the controller, we want to improve our performance with African-American-owned businesses. Likewise for our grants, which is an area of capital spending, we plan to do enhanced outreach to contractors to improve our performance with African-American contractors in particular. Our archaeology department will continue efforts to share stories learned from archaeological artifacts, which reveal information about everyday New Yorkers and more accurately reflect New York City's economic and social diversity throughout history. The remainder of this presentation will be related to the work of the research department. Historic buildings embody the stories and experiences of people, and thoughtful exploration of historical context and designations can expand public recognition and equitable representation of New York City's diverse history. Under Chair Carroll, we've been setting the Commission's designations to date and developing a set of priorities to ensure more equitable representation of New York's diverse history through our designations. In particular, we are focusing on communities whose stories and experiences have not yet been adequately told. As we strive for full inclusion, I also want to put in context designations we've done in this administration, which provides a context for how we have been approaching designations and how we will continue to. Since LPC's earliest years, the agency has been designating places of cultural and historic significance, and the Commission has for 5 decades been recognizing places related to African American history in particular. For example, the houses on Hunter's Fly Road, also known as Weeksville, was designated in 1970 as the only surviving group of houses from an early 19th century free Black community. In recent years, we've continued to advance historic district and individual landmark designations related to New York City's long and varied African American history. Examples include Mount Morris Park Historic District Extension in Harlem, home to one of New York City's most vibrant African American communities that became home to many prominent African Americans in the 1920s. The Central Harlem West 130th to 132nd Street Historic District illustrates not only the architectural development of Harlem, but the rich social, cultural, and political life of Harlem's African American population in the 20th century, and includes the national headquarters of the March on Washington, a property strongly associated with Bayard Rustin. And James Baldwin's house, which is the most significant surviving building in the United States, associated with the celebrated novelist, essayist, poet, and civil rights advocate. We have prioritized designations that reflect and foster our incredible diversity, which we believe is New York City's greatest strength. And these designations themselves are diverse. Stonewall Inn was the starting point of the Stonewall Rebellion, one of the most important sites associated with LGBTQ history in New York City and the nation. The Staten Island home of the critically acclaimed African-American novelist, poet, essayist, and feminist Audre Lorde. The Coney Island's boardwalk has given people of all economic and social backgrounds free access to the beach and seaside since 1923, and is the embodiment of Coney Island's democratic spirit. Chair Carroll is also focused on ensuring geographic diversity, and the agency has designated many firsts in their respective neighborhoods. Examples include 4 historic districts in Sunset Park, a historic district in Inwood, the Oneida Street Historic District in Hunts Point, Bronx, and recently the East 25th Street Historic District in East Flatbush. And this picture shows a community celebration on the day of designation when one of our staff members happened to be there. What we learned in these designations is that in many places, historic architecture drew people together and their community spirit grew stronger through their collective efforts to preserve it. In recent designation reports, LPC has been clear in documenting that throughout American history, there have been policies and actions at every level of government that have furthered inequities and have been racist. In recent designations such as Oneida Street in the South Bronx and Public School 48 in South Jamaica, Queens, the designation reports describe the history of redlining and disinvestment in the neighborhoods as part of the narrative. And in the designation of the row of 5 buildings that best represent Tin Pan Alley, we recognize the significant contributions and achievements of African Americans in music publishing at Tin Pan Alley. And we also acknowledge that the Jim Crow laws and other unjust discriminatory practices and entrenched systemic racism that led to the racist characters and stereotypes of African Americans in the sheet music produced at Tin Pan Alley. We will continue to address these issues. LPC's research department is committed to the highest standards of historical scholarship and archival research and to bringing complex issues to light. Their work has been aided by access to new research sources and increasing scholarship related to social justice. Many recent initiatives, such as the LGBT initiative, are the result of research department studies and years of survey and research. In addition, in districts such as Central Harlem, it took deliberate and intensive research to uncover the previously untold story of how Harlem residents adapted many of the residential buildings to accommodate a variety of cultural, religious, civic, and political uses, particularly during the Harlem Renaissance and through the 1960s, and how these institutions sustained the community and fostered social justice over decades. Finally, doing research through an equity lens can require the need for new tools, such as oral histories. The research department has incorporated community interviews and oral histories into recent work at Tin Pan Alley, Oneida Street, and East 25th Street, and plans to do so similarly with some pending designations. While our designation reports are first and foremost regulatory documents outlining significance and guidance for regulation, they also expand our understanding of history. They have incorporated deeper investigations into historical context over the years. However, because they are regulatory documents, they aren't always very accessible to the public, and they don't necessarily connect stories between designations across boroughs or decades when they were designated. To better make these connections, LPC has produced a number of story maps that are highly visual and condensed stories around themes. For example, New York City and the Path to Freedom documents designated buildings associated with the multiple ways people and institutions engaged with the anti-slavery movement before the Civil War. Doing additional research on the interconnectedness of New York City's landmarks and districts allows a fuller story and makes our city's diverse history more accessible. Through doing additional research on such sites, we have found that New York City, and Brooklyn in particular, may have one of the largest concentrations of designated sites related to abolitionist history and the Underground Railroad in the country. In summary, this year and beyond, in our research and designations, we will seek to prioritize designations that reflect the city's diversity and in areas less represented by landmarks, address difficult and contested histories, and emphasize the fight for social justice and civil rights, undertake inclusive research, and seek to tell the story of all New Yorkers. The three items being considered today are in keeping with those priorities. Conference House Park archaeological site addresses a gap in designations. It would be the city's first landmark recognizing the many generations of Native Americans who lived in the area. In addition, research staff has already started to work with the city's federally and state recognized tribes to ensure inclusive research. Holyrood Episcopal Church, Iglesia Santa Cruz, adds representation of New York City's Latino community. Finally, the education building is significant as the former home of the national office of the NAACP in the early 20th century, as well as many progressive organizations that advance social justice and equality. You will hear more about all of those from Kate. And finally, on February 2nd, we plan to bring forward the proposed Dorrance Brooks Historic District in Harlem to be considered for calendaring. We have been working with the local community for some time and are excited to be advancing it. The proposed district has highly intact streetscapes of late 19th century and early 20th century architecture and rich associations with the Harlem Renaissance and Civil Rights Movement. As we are approaching the 100-year anniversary of the Harlem Renaissance, it is particularly important and appropriate time to recognize it and celebrate the significant cultural and social history of the neighborhood. The district would be anchored by Dorrance Brooks Square, which was named after the Black serviceman who died in action while serving with a segregated military regiment in the First World War. If designated, this would be the city's first historic district named for an African American. Commissioners, thank you for your indulgence in letting us share a commitment to furthering equity and inclusion in the work we do.
Thank you so much, Lisa.